Gwinzi Shalak, Shori Crystal Gale Fraser Vilji, Anuvik Taat Daytan Show Genjik Gwitsak Gwitcha Gwitchin Ithli. Good afternoon, family, friends, colleagues. My name is Crystal Gale Fraser. I am Gwitcha Gwitchin, originally from Anuvik and my fish camp Tree River in the Northwest Territories. I am a NAC member, and I'm so happy to see you all this week. My gosh, am I full? Like, has anyone just had too much lunch, like, for many days in a row now? I'm sure we'll be blasted with another awesome coffee break snack. So, yeah. So this room, we are live streaming in here this afternoon. You don't have to move anywhere. So once we have this panel, the other presenters from next door are going to come over here and present to you. So that's how it is going to work today. And it's really my pleasure to moderate this panel. We're going to have three really excellent speakers. I'm going to introduce them at the beginning of their talks so we can get to know them a little bit better. So first up is going to be Christina Celli. Then we're going to have Jesse Boito. And finally, Min Hannaford. So first, I will read the bio for Christina and then invite her up. So Christina Celli is the Archival Research Supervisor for Hioth Met Ye Seyiagwith, or Taking Care of Our Children. This work investigates disappeared children and unmarked burial sites at 3 former Indian residential schools and 1 former Indian hospital located in Stolo Tamuk, the Fraser Valley. This work is being carried out by the Stolo Research and Resource Management Center as directed by the Stolo National Chiefs Council. Christina holds a Bachelor of History through St. Francis Xavier University and a Master's of History from the University of Victoria. Welcome, Christina. Do you have a PowerPoint?
Pardon me?
Do you have slides?
I do.
You might want to put that there. I hope that works.
Okay. Wow, we'll go from there. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to speak a little bit about how the archival work supports the Hioth Met Ye Seyiagwith work that we're carrying out in Stolo Tamuk. I want to take a moment to get my first slide up. Nope. There we are. I want to take a moment to recognize my research team, because without my research team, they uphold and support everything that we do. So I'm going to take a moment just to read everyone's name off. I am fortunate to have 8 researchers on my team, and then also work very closely with 2 genealogists, Kathleen Bertrand, Remy Benoit, Haley Decker, Raymond Cabez, Issa Campbell, Marion Mussel, Asia Mazaru, Lily Angus Pender, Lisa Davidson, and Guy Weo Mason. And of course, I'm very supported by my manager, Amber Kostachenko, who is also here today. So the goal in archival research is to assist in investigating and locating unmarked burial sites, as well as identifying loved ones who are students who either passed away at or as a result of their experience at either All Hallows boarding school in Yale, St. Mary's Mission in Mission, BC, Kokalitsa Residential School in Sardis, and Kokalitsa Indian Hospital. I do want to give a brief warning that I am going to be discussing and showing copies of records on the screen. We do have supports here from First Nations Health Authority, and they're in green, so they will be around to be with anyone who needs it. And there was one other thing. Oh, that's okay. So when I was planning for this presentation, I really had a hard time figuring out what I wanted to present on, because I like to create or cater a presentation to the audience, but people here are from all walks of lives, from all nations, and are at all different phases in their research. So I thought maybe I would just kind of go back to the basics and really give like a very broad overview of what are archives and what is archival research, what are some of the questions you want to be asking as you carry out this work, where are the documents, how to access them, and then how to prioritize some of the records based on what information you're looking for. And then I'll just finish off with some challenges. So just a background, archives are locations where there are collections of historical documents that provide information about a place, institution, or a group of peoples. And these archives can exist or be experienced in a couple of different formats. They're physical locations, as you can see in the far picture. I have a picture of BC Archives there. And usually in these physical locations is where you're going to be able to find original copies of historical records. So that means the physical papers you can hold in your hands. But also on site, they have examples like digital copies, like microfiche. For anyone who's never worked with microfiche, it's similar to a negative from a camera roll, and the archivist is there and they can help you set it up on the machine and start scanning through. The archives, these physical archives, are open for anyone to visit. And the archivists that work there are there to help you. So if you want to find records, it's a great spot. Just if you're close by, head in and talk to an archivist, tell them what you're looking for, or send them an email. Another type of archives are digital archives, which is what you see with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. This is a place where, I feel like we've heard a lot of people talk about the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation here today. So where a lot of the physical archives has sent digital copies to this one place where it can be housed. And the NCTR has a public-facing domain, which are open records, which means anybody in the general population can access these records there. But then they also have a back end, which is more private. And if you are a survivor or thriver of a residential school, you can speak with the staff there and they can help you locate your records, as well as for researchers and communities. Most of the records that we're going to be looking at are paper-based, like documents, letters, or agreements, but you can also find records of varying media, such as photographs, audio recordings, videos, and physical or artistic objects. All right. So when we were preparing for this work, we projected that we're probably going to identify upwards of 70,000 records for our 4 institutions. And with this enormous amount of records to review, it was critical for us to prioritize what we were looking for and how to approach this work. One of the challenges that we face and continue to face is that you're going to find a lot of really interesting, really important information, but you're not going to have to document it all. And so you have to decide what is worth documenting, what do you need to document, and what do you just have to review. So for us, we had to come up with very clear research questions. It was a long process, and it went through many, many revisions because language is so important. And we ended up having to have 7 unique research questions. And that is because as we were getting into the documents, we just found, they were like, well, what about this? Well, what about this? And we went from 4 questions to 7 very quickly. And these were developed through multiple conversations with the research team, but then the larger Health Met Yesiukwith, I might say XYS to shorten it up a little bit, the larger XYS team, so that includes people who are in GIS, people who are in genealogy, people who are in archaeology, and we really just wanted to be able to come at it from the get ahead of the deniers who are going to try to rip apart our work. And so if we have these clear research questions and we can back up all of our research with them, then it gives the deniers no room, no way to inch their way in. So where are the documents? The documents are in a lot of places. You can see here I've identified how many? 1, 2, 3, 7 different places that we have been able to go to get documents. And each of these different archives are going to hold different types of records. So if you go to a place like Library and Archives Canada, you're going to get a lot of the federal records. This is where you're going to get a lot of letters that were written by Indian agents, letter books, any kinds of agreements. But then also, I really like the community and private archives because the larger archives, they don't take everything. We all know that archives are somewhat problematic because you decide what to take and what not to take, and that all holds a very specific angle. But when you go to the smaller community archives, you might find objects like students' artwork, and I just love to spend time with that because, as mentioned earlier, that her name is escaping me right now, but in Squamish for the database, to have it student-centered, you want to spend time with student archives. I'm so sorry, Ashley. And then there's the religious organizations that have their own archives. With our 3 institutions, we deal with the Anglican Church, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and the United Church of Canada. I've had good experiences with 2 of those organizations and 1 not so good experience. And what I have found with that not so good experience is them almost, this would be the Oblates, passing the buck by giving their archives, all their records, to BC Archives and saying, you digitize it, you organize it, you do all this preparatory work so that we can have it. So it's just another stall tactic, and it's been quite frustrating, but I won't spend too much time on that. And then at the center, I have the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, because most of these archives should be sending all of their records to this one place. But that doesn't always happen. Records get lost, not all records get sent. And then also there's a backlog in just processing the records. And so if you want to get through these records really fast, go directly to the archives and ask them for the records themselves. I have found I've had mostly good experiences. People will give you a database, like an Excel sheet, and they'll tell you exactly what they have and provide it. And I've also found if I want to get a hold of someone at the archives, I just call them. I find it's really hard for someone to say no to you if you speak to them directly. So that would be my recommendation too. So what kind of documents are there? This is going to be the majority of my presentation, just kind of giving a rundown on the different types of records that we've been prioritizing as we work and why we've been looking at these particular records. If you are going to be here tomorrow, I'm going to be assisting in the workshop. on how to build an archival research plan and how to deal with getting things like metadata and organizing metadata. But right now, I just want to talk about the records. So one of the first types of records that we find the best kind of information in is communications-based records. So you're going to get these in areas like Library and Archives Canada, or the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, and Indian Agent letter books are a phenomenal resource to spend time with. Sometimes, very, very rarely, but sometimes we've also found letters written home from students. Communication records are really significant because they let you give you a really good picture of what the experience was like at these schools and what the overall beliefs of the day were towards Indian policy. It's hard to see. I tried to make this as big as I could, but this first letter is from an Indian agent to the Department of Indian Affairs in 1910, where it reports on the death of a pupil, and it says, quote, "The principal also reports the death of pupil number 0100, who died while she was on sick leave." And I wanted to point that out because we've heard yesterday and today that a lot of times students' names weren't even mentioned. They didn't even mention the student's name there. She was only 0100 and died on sick leave. What, did she get sick at the school? Probably. What was she sick from? Doesn't say. This is another example. It's a letter from the principal of Coquilitza to Dr. Sutherland, where he's reporting on the number of cases of measles in his school. And it says, "I have had to send a number home, and it is not always possible to fill their places at once. This," oh, I can't read that far. "Somewhat. However, we expect to close the year without a serious deficit." Thank you. So a couple of key things you want to pull out of this. First of all, there's an outbreak. There's an epidemic happening at the school right now. Number two, they're sending sick kids home. Does that mean it's going to get into the community and spread among the community? Probably. And three, they're very concerned about not filling these students' places because they're not going to have money. They're not getting the money because the spaces aren't full, and they're a little bit concerned about that. And this is the final record that I wanted to just pull up. It's from the Chief Inspector of Schools in 1918, when he reports on the Spanish flu and details the number of cases in schools and its resulting deaths. Again, none of the students are identified by their name. They are just a number on the page. A second set of records that are, have been really fundamental for us as a starting point are vital statistics, and these generally include birth, baptismal, and death records. And we have largely looked at the death certificates in our work, and they've been really, they're a great resource to an extent, because they include information like family information, home community, whether or not they received medical attention, and the circumstances relating to their death, except this is limited by who the informant is. So sometimes the Indian agent didn't really spend a whole lot of time trying to fill this out, and they wouldn't always find a family member. They would maybe just talk to the principal at the school or the Indian agent, who didn't always have the correct information. So you have to take these records with a grain of salt because the information in it might be incorrect. But I wanted to show this example of just a small snippet of a death certificate because it shows that this loved one passed away at Coquilitza Indian Hospital. It's been really hard to find records on Coquilitza Indian Hospital. We all know that there's this class action lawsuit happening and the records are locked up. We are also not able to access these records. And so a lot of the loved ones we've identified relating to Coquilitza Indian Hospital were through death certificates. And importantly, though, they were laid to rest at Squaw Indian Reserve, which was the cemetery for the hospital at the time. And we've been putting a lot of work with our genealogists, our GIS, our researchers to map the unmarked burial sites in that reserve based on information that we're finding. To get this information, I can only really speak from BC. I'm really sorry for anyone who's joining anywhere else from across Canada. But a great place to start is the BC Archives Vital Statistics. I have it shows a page on this side, I guess on the left-hand side or right-hand side for you. And sometimes the death certificates are digitized there, but not always. So if you want to use it, I can go into an example of how to use this website tomorrow for anyone who's going to be joining us, but my email is also going to be at the end of this, and if you have any questions and would like assistance, please email me. Happy to do that. But there's also 6 other locations you can try to get this information, or I guess 5. There's the Vancouver Public Library, the Okanagan Regional Library, Kelowna branch, Simon Fraser University, the Surrey Public Libraries at the Cloverdale branch. They have all the microfiche there. And so there's some benefits of going actually into those libraries where you can save copies of those records to a USB and take them back to the community with you, or you can email copies to yourself. Some of the limitations, though, I don't know if you can see, it's very small, but some of them only have very specific years, and sometimes those reels have just gone missing. So if it's not in one location, it should be in the other, but you can reach out to the libraries and they can set an appointment and certainly help you find your records there. The next type of record that we prioritized are quarterly returns. This is small. I wasn't even going to try and make it big. But what you can see on the very far right-hand side is they make little notes when a student becomes sick, or when they go to a hospital, or when they go to a preventorium. Sometimes they're discharged when they're sick. Sometimes they'll note when a student has passed away there. This is always important because if someone's discharged while ill, we want to follow up and see what happened to that person, that student. Did they go home? Did they get better? Did they go to another school? It just kind of gives us a little pathway that we want to follow. These are certainly one of the best records to start with if you're just starting off on the work. Another one, which is, again, intentionally small, is the census records. So these are legally restricted for 92 years. So the earliest census records we're going to have are from 1931. But they're really good in helping people find family connections. They also track youth sometimes, whether they're in a school or sent home or if they passed away. For us, these records are largely reviewed and transcribed by our phenomenal genealogy staff. I'm going to try and zip through the next few because I think I've got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to just show some inspection records too. These are generally going to be closed records, but you can work with the folks at the NCTR, Library and Archives Canada to get access to them. You're going to want to look for fire marshal inspection records, school inspections, medical inspections, and sanitation inspections. These also provide kind of a really good snapshot on what the student experience was like. The first report that I have here is the principal's report, and I thought this was a really important record to show because it notes that there were 12 cases of tardiness, and they were all dealt with through corporal punishment. This next 2 records are going to be pertaining to fire conditions. So this is from the Indian Agency Inspector, and I've forgotten the exact year. I know it's in the 1950s, and he raises concern over fire risk. Let me just see. He writes, quote, "I must admit that I shall be pleased when this building is rebuilt, as I dread the possibility of fire. I think some additional rope, ladder, fire escapes could well be put in the upper boys' dormitory. Possibly there are some left over from old Lytton School. The girls' classrooms are very cramped for room." And then that same decade, but well, I guess this was from the 1950s, and this record is now from the 1960s, and written by the fire marshal. He writes, "This school is definitely overcrowded, having approximately 256 boys and girls. The fire escapes are inadequate. There is very little firefighting equipment about the buildings. The building which housed the students is a fire hazard." And so you can see that there was knowledge over time that the buildings were inadequate and were likely cause for great harm to the students, but there was no real push to get things fixed really quickly. And then the last inspection report is from the 1960s, where it discusses the cramped and overcrowded conditions that the students were having to live in. This is also from St. Mary's. "The present dormitories have been commented on unfavorably in numerous reports. Certainly, one of the greatest problems at present is an absolute shortage of every kind of space where both personal and school items can be stored." So I really love this record because he acknowledges that there's been a problem for a long time and no one's done anything. But I wanted to end on what would be my favorite types of records to review, and these are the commencement annuals or newsletters. And I particularly love these records because they really show the students' voices. It's one of the few records and archives where you do get a chance to see the students' voices, and sometimes they can be really fun. And luckily, we have examples from all of our schools. We have All Hallows in the West, a number of records from All Hallows, the Kokolitsa commencement exercises, there's a number of those, and the Grotto, which is from St. Mary's. And unfortunately, they only had 1 year where they had published. But this is an example from Kokolitsa commencement annual, and I've blanked out all the names, but I just want to read 2 different examples from here. So when a class was graduating, they would have the class history and the class will. So for one of the students in the class history, her class name was Christy. She was from Hazelton, and she finished high school and was class president. Her chief occupation was counting the days before vacation commences. Her ambition was to be a first-degree stenographer. Her pet aversion was oral French and baking pies. Didn't like that. And her pet expression was, ain't women curious? And then in the class will, I'm just going to identify folks by their initials, but E.G. wrote, "I hereby leave and bequeath to my honorable friend E.W. an empty box of chocolate, to G.L. a half pair of shoes for keepsake, to O.A. my share of peanut butter at the breakfast table." They're all quite cute. And I'm just going to finish off on some of the challenges, particularly barriers to access. So I almost feel like I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir here, but I just want to say it out loud anyways. The agreement-based process that we have to go through to get access to these records is time-consuming. And they only provide access to view records, not to actually receive them into our archives. Records are missing. So because records were transferred from location to location, sometimes they just went missing along the way. But then also sometimes I'm finding records are being removed from archives. And so I'd really like for those archives who are currently removing records from their platform to just provide a list of what's being removed so that we can go through the process of filling out a HIPAA, a FIPA, a ATIP request to get access to those records. But if you don't actually let us know you have them, how are we supposed to find them? Also, like I said, the hospital records have gone missing. Stala Research and Resource Management Center sits on the former site of Kokolitsa Indian Hospital, but we don't actually have those records. Library and Archives have them, and we don't have access to them. So this is just a little call out to Library and Archives Canada and the federal government to give us those records. Records are incomplete. We're getting a lot of cover letters in our research saying there's a report like this that's attached, but it's not actually attached. So now you have to go and try and find that report. Records were destroyed. This was, as far as the government was concerned, just another policy. And when things were ending, why keep those records long term? There's language barriers. We have to work with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, so you have to understand not just French, but Old French. We've got a few French-speaking folks on our team, but even then, it can be a bit challenging. Archival records are generally colonial-based, so they're government and church records, so you really have to read between the lines to get those students' stories. Lots of duplicate records. This is the bane of my existence and the bane of everyone's existence in here, I'm sure, who's carrying out this work. I swear I've seen upwards of like 6 of the same record in the NCTR because they've received them from 6 different archives. Oh, it drives me bonkers, and it's just a waste of time if you're reviewing the same record over and over and over again. There's a lack of transparency, so that would be my call out to the Oblates not making their records really quite available to us. Give us those finding aids. Do the work yourself. Don't just pawn it off on BC Archives. And then just the sheer number of volume of records to review. There's just, it seems never ending and very, very overwhelming. So if anyone is feeling that, I feel it with you. It's just one step at a time. So I'm going to end it there. This was, again, just like a very broad overview for folks who are just, I would say, starting off this work or have ever wondered what archival research is. I have my email there. If anyone wants questions and can't come to the training session tomorrow, please reach out anytime. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Christina. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jesse Boito. He is the senior archivist and a member of the Métis Nation. He completed his master's in archival studies at the University of Manitoba and focused on the intersections between Western archival theory and practice and Indigenous notions of archives and memory to shed light on how the NCTR can accommodate and blend multiple viewpoints. He works within a close archives team to process records collected by the TRC, make new collections available online, and respond to access requests from residential school survivors. He is also continually researching ways to leverage new technologies to honor the experiences and truths of survivors through innovative and participatory archival practices. So please welcome Jesse.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was just bragging to my colleagues about how liberating it was to come up here without any speaking notes, and now I'm finding out that it's also terrifying, but we're going to go through it. And there's actually been a lot of sort of overlap and common themes throughout the presentations this morning, so I'm glad that I was able to attend those, and I'm going to try and address them as I go through my presentation. Big button. Okay. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be going over 3 different sections. The first one will be an overview of the NCTR archives and a bit of a background and context on how the records came to the NCTR. And then I'll be talking a little bit about how you can access or make access requests for records. And then finally, what types of records can be found within the archives. So these will be fairly high level, high overview, and then in tomorrow's workshop, we'll be going a bit more in depth, and then we'll be able to dig a bit deeper then. So first off, a bit of an overview. So this morning, Kayla and Eugene provided really great overview on sort of how the NCTR came to be through the TRC, through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So I won't cover that too much, but I will add that the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, or the IRSA, it didn't fall out of the sky. It wasn't a gift from the federal government. It was a settlement agreement. The federal government had to settle because of the efforts of thousands of survivors for more than a decade pushing for justice for what occurred to them at residential school. So I like to acknowledge that, because if it were not for those efforts, there would not have been a settlement agreement, there would not have been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and we would not be standing here having this discussion here today. Again, talking about our mandate, that was covered pretty well this morning. So I'm just going to jump into the NCTR archives and its holdings. So I've got a graphic up on screen here that gives a bit of a breakdown of the composition of records that are held within the archives. So here you can see on the left-hand side that those are the records that are currently on our public database. So right now there's a little over 71,000 records, or about 2-ish% of our overall holdings are publicly available. And the bulk of those records are going to be government records, with the second sort of largest sliver being private, or being church records, and then the next one being private donations. And then if you flip over to the right-hand side there, you'll see within our internal database, we have about 3.2 million records that have been processed and ingested into the database. And then we have over 800,000 records that are still yet to be processed. Many of these records, these are records from the TRC. They aren't all historical residential school records. It is going to be a mix, and as Christina mentioned, there's a lot of duplication as well. So we're sort of parsing through that backlog to understand what is new and unique to put into the archive. But I will stress the importance of not deduplicating the records too much. It is a bit of an added struggle trying to sort of go through the records knowing that there are duplicates. But each version of that record tells a different story, especially for the NCTR, where records came from a lot of different sources. Those different versions of the different records were used for very different purposes. Some were used within the federal government for litigation, and that same copy could be from the church, it could be from the government. So we try not to remove those from the database, even though it does add a bit of extra time to try to slog through it all. So looking at the records that were provided by church entities, you heard from my colleagues earlier that there were more than 100 different sources of records for church records. And although that is true that the TRC did engage with more than 100 different church repositories or entities across the country over a 5-year period. In reality, there were only 71 that provided copies of records to the TRC, and it totaled about 234,000 records. So the reasoning why there's a bit of a discrepancy there is because some of these entities that were engaged by the TRC either did not hold any relevant records based on the relevancy laid out in the settlement agreement, and others were not party to the settlement agreement, so they were able to sort of dodge the process. So we're currently working with a number of different church organizations because we know not all records were disclosed to the TRC. So this work is ongoing, and the map that you can see on screen right now represents those originating sites where those records currently reside, if you wanted to access the originals. But I will note that some of these smaller ones, they actually provided the records to the TRC, including copyright and ownership, and those records only reside at the NCTR. That was a bit more of a rare occurrence. So for the most part, copyright ownership remains with these church archives, church entities, and at the NCTR, we hold copies of these records. And then if you drill down there, you can see that this represents the largest church site, as the TRC called it. This is the United Church General Synod Archive, and it represents close to 50,000 records. And then on the government side, this one's a bit more complicated because there were multiple waves of disclosures from provincial, federal, and municipal archives to the TRC. So depending on the time period, the records were disclosed. For example, the Department of Justice out in British Columbia, a lot of the records were sort of being managed and funneled through them in the earlier days. Whereas you can see on the map here, there's also a dot, large dot, which I can zoom in here. You'll see there in Ottawa, so INAC, ANDC, now CIRNAC, that was a large source of government records, as well as Library and Archives Canada. The Ottawa branch being the biggest producer of records to the TRC, but also other LAC locations across the country, such as Winnipeg and Burnaby. And then here you can see these are points on the map differentiated with different colors based on the event type. These are the 90 events that were hosted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And what came out of that were more than 7,000 individual statements. So that's a mix of private one-on-one statements, as well as public statements that were provided in sharing circles and sharing panels. And also what came of that is a high volume of photographs as well. And then it was mentioned earlier, the material objects. So there were more than 1,000 different material objects within our collections. And as Eugene mentioned, the sacred items are held at the Manitoba Museum, where they actually have a sacred item space where elders can come in and smudge the items and address them in any way that's culturally appropriate based on the information that was provided to the TRC. And I will do an archival geek out a little bit with the bentwood box items because they are really unique in the sense that there are roughly 750 individual items that were gifted to the bentwood box that traveled across the country, and at each of the national events, items were gifted to the box, but not only gifted, there's also video of the individuals providing those items to the bentwood box. So not only do we have the items that were gifted as expressions of reconciliation, we also have those audio-visual testimonies that provide context about the content. So I'm going to try out an analogy that may or may not land, but I'm just going to go for it. We've been talking a lot about residential school records and how scattered they are and how a lot of them are missing. So the records that have come to the NCTR, we know it's not a complete set of records, and it's almost like a puzzle that you would purchase from a garage sale or from a Goodwill. You buy the puzzle and you know there's going to be pieces missing, but you put that puzzle together, you take it apart, you put it back together, and you get to know that puzzle and which pieces are missing. And each time we visit with different community members, different lead communities, although we are the experts at the NCTR of our puzzle that is incomplete, each time we meet with a different community, we better understand those missing pieces, because these communities, you are the experts of those pieces that fill in the gaps of the record. So that's why these types of events are so powerful. And going back to the earlier presentation from Ashley, it got me thinking quite a bit. Because I was always thinking that we would all have to be using the same systems that could speak to each other so that we could share information and content. But when you were talking about how there's only a discrete number or types of records, there's also a discrete number of children who attended residential school. So we don't necessarily need to all be using the same systems, but we need to be speaking the same language in terms of how we categorize and tag and assign numbers and unique identifiers to these records and individuals. So I would really like to speak more about that, and if we could all be using the same types of identifiers for those same records across platforms, across repositories, then I think we can start creating a bit of a roadmap. So that we don't all have to be describing these records in the same way. We can provide our own context to the records, but we can make those connections because we're using the same identifiers. And as Eugene mentioned, the 215 really did, it was a really important moment for this type of work, in particularly around the different organizations who were not willing to work with us and provide copies of records and access to records for communities. So since 2021, this new urgency to provide copies of records, we are meeting with both government and church organizations to collect and identify as many relevant records as possible so that we can then in turn make them available to survivors, their families, and community members. So here's a bit of a snapshot of some of the incoming collections. We have a large project that has been ongoing for a couple of years now with CIRNAC, or Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. The project is on hold currently, but it is estimated that there could be up to 20 million records, a mix of both historical and contemporary records from the federal government and its departments. So that work is on hold, but much work has already been done. And then next, we are working with Library and Archives Canada, specifically on RG10, those are the Indian Affairs records, as well as day school records. So there's that project has also been ongoing, and it is also on hold as we work out some of the logistics on digitization and transfer. But a lot of work has already been put into place there, and we're hoping that we can move these along sooner than later so we can facilitate access to these records for survivors and their communities. And then there's the Oblates of the Mary Immaculate, OMI Lacombe. These records, as previously mentioned, are scattered kind of everywhere and moved in different places at different time periods over the past 100 or so years. So primarily, they can be found at the Provincial Archives of Alberta, the Royal BC Museum, the de Châtelet Archives, among others. So we are working with these different record repositories to identify what records were not disclosed to the TRC, so we can create a plan to digitize and send those over to the NCTR. And those records have been trickling in over the past couple of years, and we anticipate that that work will be ongoing for a number of years, because a lot of these organizations don't have a lot of staff, and they have backlogs of kilometers of records, and to process that type of material it's going to take a very long time. And then we have records from other types of archives and record holders through Call to Action 77. So those will be, we get a lot of responses from provincial archives, from municipal archives who were not engaged with during the TRC process, but have come forward stating that they do hold residential school records and they're wanting to make copies available. And then also, we get quite a few private donations. These can be textual records, like letter books, and they can also be photographs, they can be film. One example, someone saw a photograph from a photo album from a residential school for sale on eBay. They purchased it and they made a digital version to send to us to make available to the survivors of that residential school. Okay, so now I'm going to be going into how to access records. So primarily our function is to make records, copies of records available to survivors and their family members. So that's sort of our bread and butter. We've been doing that for a long time now. And so what happens is a survivor or a family member will reach out. We will collect as much information as possible on the name of the individual, alternate spellings, family members, dates of the school attended, and that sort of thing. And then once we've collected that information, then we can do a deep dive into the archives and identify as many relevant records as possible for that individual or individuals. As Kayla mentioned earlier, we had one request where there was 14 siblings. So you can imagine that request took a little longer than most requests. And some requests could take a half a day. Some can take a week to find as many relevant records as possible based on the time period and based on the schools attended. And we do prioritize survivor requests over other types of requests. So if we get a request from a survivor, that request is fast-tracked. And as a result of that, I'll show you the other types of requests here. Third-party requests, which is a request from a family member looking for copies of records of a parent, of a grandparent. Those requests will take longer just because we do prioritize those requests from survivors. And then over the past number of years, we've sort of shifted a little bit from only providing individual-based access to providing community-based access. So we sort of have a two-pronged approach. The first one, working with our proactive disclosure of records process. So that's where we will sit down. Usually when we first meet with a community, we will learn to understand what are their research parameters. Are you looking for multiple schools? You're looking for one school. So we will identify a subset of records. Generally speaking, we'll look at maps and plans if the community is looking at unmarked burial research. We'll also look at admissions and discharge records, quarterly returns, sometimes photographs. And we will put together a package of sort of like the low-hanging fruit type of records, and we'll put that together that we can review and release relatively quickly. Usually it's about a 2 to 4 week turnaround. And as that is being processed, then that's when we work on a memorandum of agreement to provide remote access to community researchers so that they can stay in community and access those 3.2 million records remotely from home. And we do provide some basic training as well on how to use the system. And through the proactive disclosure process, we've released about 80,000 records since 2018. Not all of those have made their way to the public website, but we do have a backlog there that we're starting to go through, and we're being a bit more I don't think aggressive is the right word, but we're being a bit more aggressive on how quickly the pacing is so that we can get more records publicly available. So what kind of records can be found? Christina gave a really good overview, so I won't spend a ton of time here, and we will be going into this a little bit more in depth later. But here you can see we have about, in archive jargon, they call them genres of records. So these are kind of like the different record types. We have about 123 of them at the NCTR, and some of the most popular ones are going to be photographs. So we have just over 26,000 photographs on our public website. Sadly, I would say at least 99% of them, they're photographs, but there's no names attached to them. And for a lot of them, they're not even attached to a school, because when they were provided to the TRC, there was no metadata or information attached to them. So they're photographs, but we don't know where they're from and who's in them. Last September, I had the opportunity to go to Williams Lake in BC and sit with Whitney and Charlene there for a few days, and it was an incredible event because they rented out a community center, and they had a number of round tables, kind of like what we see here today, and they had printed out copies of photographs on all the tables, and survivors and former students from that school came through for an entire week and engaged with the photographs, provided identification, provided stories that come from seeing these photographs. And it was really powerful to see everybody coming together and seeing former classmates. So photographs are a really powerful tool to bring people together. Next up, the quarterly returns. We have almost 4,400 public quarterly returns, but it's a bit of a misleading number because the way that they were processed with the TRC is that each record that you see on our public site will be a series of 30 images from the microfilm reels. So one record could be many records, many returns within that record. So it's a bit of a misleading number, but obviously these records are a wealth of knowledge, not just for individuals looking for their own records, but for community-led research trying to find information on missing children. Next up is the maps and plans. So online right now we have a little over 1,100 public maps, and we're working to release about another 10,000 because generally speaking, from an access and privacy standpoint, maps and plans are really low risk as far as disclosing private and sensitive information. So we will be making those more publicly available very soon. What else? And then we have the TRC event records. So you can see we have a little over 2,100. So that's going to be a mix of those public sharing circles, sharing panels. And what we've done for most of the events is we've taken those large sharing panels and circles. Some of them could be upwards of 12 hours long, and we've divided them based on speaker. So now you can look through and find the individual speakers, but also view the entire length of that video as well, as sort of a closer representation of how those videos were captured in the first place. And then next up, we have 775 records from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And this one I find especially fascinating once we got them into our system, because we tag the majority of our records with place access points. So now you can start to sort of layer the TRC events with the RCAP events. So when you click on one place that hosted an RCAP session or event as well as a TRC event, then you can start to see these sort of different places in time, but addressing a lot of this similar issues, but 20 years later. And then the last record type that I'm going to highlight is our educational resources. So these aren't necessarily, these aren't archival records, but we've incorporated them into our archival database. so that they could live beside those archival resources. And what's really interesting about it is that once you can start linking them to the different schools, then when individuals, specifically teachers, are looking for lesson plans and different resources to bring into the classroom, then they can take a look at contemporary educational resources as well as historical documents. My wife's a teacher, my mom was a teacher, so I understand firsthand how difficult it can be to create content from scratch. And a lot of educators won't bring this into their classroom because they don't have time to create the content. So keeping this section updated and up to date can be really helpful for those educators who desperately need to get this content into the classroom. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And I'll now introduce our last speaker. We will have a little bit of a question period before the break. Min Hannaford is an archivist at the Vancouver office of Library and Archives Canada. With a dedication for preserving history and sharing knowledge, Min is committed to delivering information and archival services through reference support and public programming activities. She also supports various initiatives such as Connection to Kith and Kin, an Indigenous genealogy workshop to ensure that greater access to historical resources are available to communities and individuals. I would like to invite Min up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, NAC, for inviting Library and Archives Canada, and thank you, Trina, for organizing this panel. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. I'll be discussing Indigenous... Sorry, did I touch this? Sorry. I'll be discussing Indigenous history research at Library and Archives Canada. This session will provide an overview about LAC and the records and the resources available for conducting research related to Indigenous history. If you're joining the workshop tomorrow, I'll be providing additional insights into conducting research, and we'll explore techniques for accessing hospital and residential school records. I'll be here all day tomorrow for any specific questions about your research. Okay, so over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to explore a number of key resources at Library and Archives Canada. Today, we'll provide a brief introduction before moving on to look at some of the resources that can help you get started with your research. We'll cover where to start, what are the records you'll be looking at, and how the Access to Information and Privacy, or ATIP, works at LAC. To wrap things up, we'll provide information on the services offered by Indigenous Reference team, as well as information and services offered by the local Vancouver office. Okay. Library and Archives Canada, or LAC, is the combined National Archives and National Library of Canada. LAC's primary goal is to preserve and make available the documentary heritage of Canada. The photos on this slide just show a few aspects of our work, including storing multitudes of boxes of paper files, books, microfilm reels, and also working with the records in conservation and digitization labs. To give you a sense of the scale of the collection, it includes over 20 million books published in various languages, over 250 linear kilometers of government and private textual records, 30 million photographs, and more than 3 million architectural drawings, plans, and maps. There's also a vast trove of audio and video material, works of art, newspapers, sheet music, and more. LAC has 4 service points across Canada located in Halifax, Ottawa, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. Before we begin to look at the resources and records, I want to speak of some of the language and terminology that is used in the records that we will be speaking about today. Certain parts of the collection held by LAC contains historical language and content that may be considered offensive or potentially harmful, such as language used to refer to racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. The items in the collections and their contents and descriptions reflect the period in which they were created and the views of their creator. They retain their original description to ensure that the attitudes and perspectives are not erased from historical record. LAC does, however, provide additional description information to offer more context of the records. This is an ongoing process. You can find some guidelines and examples on our webpage, titles for description of Indigenous-related archival content. Who is researching and using the records? Government records are typically used for researching historical and contemporary relations with the Canadian government, land claims, treaties, Indigenous rights. These records are invaluable for historians, researchers, and Indigenous communities seeking to understand the history, the policies, and interactions that have shaped Indigenous settler relations in Canada. One area of research that is increasing in popularity is genealogy research. Indigenous genealogy can be about reconnection and identity, learning family history, and honoring Indigenous histories. For new researchers or for experienced researchers looking for a refresher or new items, I recommend starting on our Indigenous history page, where you'll discover the unique collection of resources and information on various topics related to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation experiences and contributions to Canada. In particular, you'll find resources related to residential schools and specific information for genealogy research that is grouped together. You can also learn about We Are Here Sharing Stories. It's an initiative to digitize archival material relating to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis Nation communities, and includes textual material, photographs, artwork, maps, and publications. Also on this webpage, you can access a list of research and guides and resources that can provide additional and useful information when researching various aspects of Indigenous history. You can search the whole guide. So I think Jesse already mentioned Record Group 10 or RG10. This is one of the most important groups of records at LAC relating to Indigenous history and genealogy and it's the records of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development FAO, or what is now known as CERNAC and ISC. These records are generally organized by band, agency, provincial, and religious affiliations. In Vancouver, we hold an extensive collection of 5,000 boxes containing materials created by the BC and Yukon districts of the Department of Indian Affairs, and these can be consulted for personal or professional research. So the types of records found in RG10. We have census records, vital statistics, minutes of council, estate records and wills. These documents record vital information on the deceased, ownership of land and other assets, debts, information on heirs, and next of kin. Land records and surveys of reserves, rights of way, leases, sale of individual land holdings. There are enfranchisement files. They might contain information about an individual or a family's enfranchisement. There's education records, including residential schools and day schools. There's natural resources records documenting activities that take place on Indigenous lands, including fishing, hunting, mining, timber, trap lines, and oil and gas. And then there's membership records, which there's different types of lists, including distribution, census, and membership. There's also engineering services, which include water supply systems, bridges, electric power, and roads. This is merely a sample of some of the types of historical records in the collection. The list of various aspects of Indigenous lives that were administered by the Government of Canada is quite extensive. Residential school records. Earlier on the Indigenous history page, there's a web page dedicated to residential school records. This includes, before you get started, places to look and search tips. We are going to be putting on our website an expanded, in-depth guide to researching residential school records, and there'll be information for each province. So this page in particular provides guidance on various ways to approach your research. Some places to look, including federal records, church records, things that Jesse and Christina mentioned earlier. There are many more documents, as you know, produced by provincial, territorial, and religious administrations. So these are just some of the types of residential school records. There's a wide variety of them that deal with various aspects of the school's administration, and I'll just repeat that it's really about the administration of the schools that you'll see in these records. But the names of pupils can be generally found in this top row of records, so attendance and discharges, principal's monthly report, transportation for students, quarterly returns, and daily registers. And the number and types of records available for each residential school really vary significantly, and this is attributed to the department's record keeping at the time, and there was also a time when these records were not considered archival, meaning there'll be gaps in the records. As you heard, some of these records were digitized by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and transferred to the NCTR. At LAC, there was also a mass digitization project, school file series, where microfilm reels were digitized, and they're available online. Tomorrow, I can provide a demonstration. We also have the hospital and sanatoriums. There were 3 in BC, Kokolitsa, Nanaimo, and Miller Bay. The typos of records that can be found are mainly administrative and patient files, and they can be found in the Health Canada collection and the Indian and Inuit Affairs program. I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, access to information and privacy. So we'll talk a little bit about the 2 acts and what are document restrictions and the types of requests that you can make. So the Access to Information Act gives every Canadian citizen, permanent residents, and any person or corporation present in Canada a right to access the records of government institutions that are subject to the Act. At LAC, this means you can request any government record from the 300 existing and defunct departments that is part of our holdings. This includes CERNAC, Fishery and Oceans, RCMP, and more. At other institutions, when you make this request, it will likely be only of their own holdings. The Privacy Act gives everyone the right to access their personal information held by government institutions that are subject to the Act, protects that information against unauthorized collection, use, and retention and disclosure. Your information is private and can only be requested by yourself or someone you have authorized. To obtain personal information belonging to someone else, you must have their written consent authorizing you to receive their personal information. An example of a privacy request would be if someone was looking for their attendance at a residential school or day school, or a military personnel record. Something that anyone researching archives will come across is document restrictions. There are generally two types of restrictions for government documents. So you can see here on the top of the slide, this is just a screenshot of the conditions of access, which can be found online on any record. And you can see here it says consulted 32, restricted by law. So Code 32, or restricted by law, simply means that these records need to be reviewed for sensitive information before it can be accessed. Government records are, by default, generally restricted. This is the case unless the records have been previously reviewed. Open, or Code 90, the records have been previously reviewed or block reviewed and can be accessed by anyone. This does not mean that the file has been digitized. ATIP requests can seem complicated, so we have the ATIP assistance that can help you choose which type of request you would like to make. As I mentioned, when you're making a request under the Access to Information Act, anyone can make this request. An example might be a researcher examining how mining rights were established and what the implications are for the community, or were for the community. In this case, no personal information is being sought. In terms of residential school records, this can be the case for the building records, the maps, the plans, school land, surveys around the schools, church lands. All those records might have none or very limited amount of personal information, so could be requested under the Access to Information Act. And then, as I said, a request under the Privacy Act might be someone looking for their education records. And then the last one on this slide is the request for personal information under paragraph 82K of the Privacy Act. As some of you may already know, there is a process in which Indigenous researchers can access personal information. So if you are researching on behalf of a First Nation for the purposes of researching or validating the claims, dispute, or grievance, you can make a request for personal information under paragraph 82K of the Privacy Act. Tomorrow, I'll go into a bit more detail about 82Ks and what are the different requirements. We have just a quick word about our services. So in Ottawa, we have the Indigenous Reference Services. It's a team of dedicated archivists, and they provide various services, including specialized reference appointments, presentations, workshops, guided tours in Ottawa, and I have put in the main lobby area some handouts with their contact information. And of course, because we are here in Vancouver, a word about LAC Vancouver. Our office is downtown, and it's adjacent to the central branch of the Vancouver Public Library. We also have a service point within the central library in the VPL Special Collections. Our staff is available at this service point for anyone, and no appointment is necessary. Our services include both in-person and remote assistance, and we offer guidance in reference and genealogy. As I mentioned earlier, our holdings include approximately 5,000 boxes of historical archival material created by the BC and Yukon offices of the federal department, now known as CERNAC and ISC. And so if you're from a community here in BC or the Yukon, we likely have some records that are relevant to your research, and I recommend that you contact us for help with your research. And I will just note that our records are not on site. They are kept at an off-site storage. That's it for me. However, I was just inspired by Jennifer's presentation this morning. So I wanted to just quickly mention that the Documentary Heritage Program, Communities Program, is open for proposal right now. And the purpose of this program is to provide $1.5 million in funding each year to local organizations in support of Canada's documentary heritage. Some examples might be photographs, audiovisual recordings, diaries, maps, and treaties. And the purpose is to increase access or awareness to the holdings. There is various levels of funding available, and the call for proposals is until January 2025. We do provide some webinars on how to complete the budget form, so you can sign up. The next one is November 21st. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have some time for questions and comments. I understand that I have help in the room to run microphones. Is that correct? They're both right up here. Is this on? This is on. So, any questions or comments for our panel today? I see one in the back there. Thank you.
So just with Jesse's comments on the church, one of the things that everybody needs to look at when you are working with the Roman Catholic Church, when we were going through the negotiations with them, the Kamloops Diocese did not come into effect until 1942. And under canon law, it states that the church is the one who owns all the records. And so anything up to 1942, the Kamloops Indian Band owned all our records. And it was taken off reserve and moved to OLPH. And that is something that everybody else needs to take a look at, is when did the diocese come into effect in your area that has residential schools? Because the church on your reserve is the one who legally owns the records, not the church.
I wanted to comment on the Library Archives of Canada presentation that was just made here. I've done quite a bit of research in the Library Archives of Canada for quite a while, doing it on land claims, community research, lands administration. This is the first time I've looked at it from the residential school perspective. But just when people are getting into this research and they're not used to what they're reading in those documents, like it's a word of caution, because when I first started out looking at the documents, I would look at, say, a land record for land claims. We were doing land claims, and we're doing that right now. They're extensive, and usually when you go to Ottawa, you get a microfilm, and your information is at a specific part of that microfilm. But as you go through it looking for your reserve, for us it's Cowessess, looking for that specific information, you can gaze and read other files that are in there. And it's those other files that are really disturbing. And I used to get hung up on them, reading how they treated our people at the time. And I'll give you an example. On the reserve on Cowessess just before 1960, we couldn't do anything. The Indian Affairs person managed our money. If I wanted to go work for a farmer, I would go work for that farmer, but the Indian Affairs guy would take a book and he'd mark a debit on the farmer's account and plus me on my account. Like there was no economic development. Everything depended on him. And up until that time, you didn't have to talk to Indians. You didn't have to manage them, or you just had to manage them. You didn't have to really, consult them on anything. That's what agency means. We don't have agency, or we didn't have choice. And so The one thing that I was looking at at the time was there was a significant amount of people enfranchising. That meant they wanted to get off the reserve. The conditions were bad for some of the families. In fact, a lot of the families. They were poor. We still lived in log houses. And I was born in 1955. There was still log shacks on our reserve. That's where I lived for the first 5 years until I went to residential school. So they were poor. And when they'd apply to move off the reserve to go to the city, like a lot of the women were left with the children on the reserve, living in a log house. We were lucky we had a wood floor. Other families just had dirt. Like this was in 1960, before 1960. The water was a half a mile away for a lot of cases. And that was getting good water. At least we got good water. But that was a lot of work for people. And by then, after being Catholic for about 3 or 4 generations, everybody had lots of kids. And you didn't have, like I said, you couldn't even get jobs. So all I'm saying is people were poor. And when you're looking at our history, that really isn't our history. That's what somebody else is saying our history is. They're looking at it and they're commenting, and the comments, to tell you the truth, were so disparaging. Very, very disparaging. And they would be recommending somebody to be enfranchised. That means somebody up above you would sign the paper and you could leave the reserve finally and go to Regina and get a house where you had at least running water or something. And so, but it was a chore. The Indian Affairs guy either did it or he didn't do it. And one of them was begging him. I was reading the letter. At least sign it so I can get off the reserve. And then writing back again and asking him, well, at least give me a train ticket to get back home, you know, and begging things like that. There was five kids in that family. They were all listed. And I know that family. And so now 1960 comes along, people can leave the reserve, they can vote. The same family. All of those kids were gone. Like they were taken by social services, because when they left the reserve, what the Indian Affairs guy said about that woman, it was very disparaging. She doesn't look after her kids. She has a dirty house. Like, what the heck do you expect? They're living in log shacks with nothing in the middle of winter sometimes. So that was how they were treated, for one thing. And when you read that type of information on those documents about your own people and your family, you know, that affects you a lot. So over the years, I've got accustomed to that. Now, what I wanted to bring you some notice to, it's kind of, I guess it's not really funny, but in 1960, they had to decide they're going to let Indians off the reserve now. And so now Indian Affairs has to prepare their staff to now accommodate this new relationship. And rather, they've got to try and cultivate some kind of a relationship with Indians that they've been ignoring all of these years. So on Cowessess, we had an agency, Crooked Lake Agency. It looked after all of the local reserves, but the central was on our reserve. And the Indian Affairs agent lived on our reserve up until 1960. And finally, when they had to leave, they went to Yorkton. So now they managed us from Yorkton. They have these directives going around now that they have to like deal with Indians. So they decided over in Yorkton Agency that, well, we should maybe go out to those reserves now and set up an office twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, so we can listen to the Indians and listen to what these people have to say, these people. But I just want to tell you this. There's do's and don'ts here, and a whole list of them. Like, this is an actual file that we got in Winnipeg a couple of months ago, a whole box of files from our tribal council because we requested them, and we got all of them. There are boxes and boxes and boxes. And this is policy in 1960. And this is what they said. This is how much they knew about Indians. This is the do, telling their Indian agents now, all of the Indian affairs staff do. It says they, number one, give praise to the Indian for a job well done and for even his smallest attempts to improve conditions. Let the degree of praise equal the degree of improvement. For a major improvement, mention it publicly when an opportunity to do so naturally presents itself. Like, that's what they were telling their staff. And I was telling this to one of our policemen. He helps us with some of the research. And he said that's how they talk to a dog. You know, that's how you talk to animals. And then there's the next, there's how much of them here? There's 20 of them, 20 do's. The next on the list is don'ts here. It says, visit an Indian home. Don't visit an Indian home as a fault finder, but rather make mention of their achievements, i.e., new linoleum, a clean floor, children well cared for, new curtains, etc., when you can honestly do so. Like, that's what they thought of us. That's how small they thought we were compared to them. So when you're looking at these files, you see a lot of other things other than just what you're looking at there. And in terms to, I didn't want to talk too long, but in Cowsis's case, in 1966-67, they did a residential school study in Saskatchewan, and you can find it on the internet. Look under 9 residential schools in Saskatchewan, and you'll find it. It's there. And they did a very detailed study using a Western method, but they numbered us. They knew exactly how much of us were there, because I was there from 60 to 68, and they numbered all of the schools. There was 9 of them. And on Cowsis, it was starting to move into not so much education anymore, but these kids needed care. So they were bringing them in not for education, but for care. They had no place else to get them. And if you read it, you'll find out that's where the 60s scoop started, because they were already planning in that report what they're going to do with these kids. And they would go to good Indian homes, then they would go to good white homes, but of course they all left. Out of 100 kids that were at school in that year, and myself included, 75 of them were in there because they needed care. The rest of us, I guess, was for education. And so the study was on the quality of care. So it wasn't on the quality of education, quality of care. The end recommendation was Catholics get out of the residential school business, running them, and to the federal government was to end residential schools. And that was the first indication they were going to stop. And they left Cowsis in 1975. So that's all the caution about reading those. Mm-hmm. They're very, very hurtful, because those 5 kids, when they left, they had a really sad life, you know, and they were right down here. Mm-hmm. And so that's all I've got to say is, like, it's a history. It still lives with us. It lives in those records. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, that reminds me of, there is an Indigenous studies scholar named Diane Million, and she has written about what she calls the felt archive, that we go into the archive and these records produce certain feelings. We can very visually and sometimes physically resonate with the pain that our ancestors felt in these records. We are going to have to close the Q&A period for now. I really encourage everyone to reach out to our speakers over the break. We are going to be reconvening at 3 o'clock. Anyone who is in this room, you're going to come back to this room, and the other speakers next door are going to come to you. So thank you so much to our speakers. Why don't we give them a round of applause, and we'll see you at 3 o'clock.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. If I can ask David and Kristen to come up, please. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us to the Oral History and Statement Gathering Workshop. My name is David Aglukak. I'm Inuk from Alvet, Nunavut on the west coast of Hudson Bay. Currently, I'm the program manager for missing and needy children from residential schools at Nunavut out of Iqaluit, Nunavut. I'm also a National Advisory Committee member. I'm pleased to be joined by our panelists this afternoon, Kayla Johnson, Kristen Kozar, David McAtackney, and next forth. As the Director of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, Kayla Johnson oversees matters related to the support of educators, development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Additionally, Kayla oversees statement gathering activities in communities for those wishing to share their stories and experiences related to residential schools, day schools, and other colonial systems. Prior to joining the NCTR, Kayla worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer and coordinator to support statement gathering activities. She holds a BA in Criminal Justice from the University of Winnipeg and a Master's of Science in International Crimes and Criminology from Free University in Amsterdam. Kristen Kozar is a member of the Witsum First Nation located in Canoe Pass with familial ties to the Musqueam Indian Band, Penelecu Tribe, and Lumi Nation. Kristen is the Executive Director at the Center and works closely with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation to assist in gaining better access of residential school records for First Nations in BC. She is also the co-lead of the Oral Testimony Program. Her work in research and engagement centers Indigenous data sovereignty and the inherent right to data with working with residential school and Indian hospital records. Kristen works towards building relationships and walking alongside internal and external Indigenous units at UBC. She firmly believes in the importance of interpersonal relationships and cultural humility when working with Indigenous individuals, community, and content. Prior to joining the team at IRSHTC, Kristen worked with various Indigenous organizations and communities, including her own, serving on the Witsum Council for 6 years. Kristen holds a Master's in Library and Information Studies with a concentration in First Nations curriculum and is currently working on her PhD at the UBC iSchool with a full focus on Indigenous data sovereignty and residential school records. David McCatney is the research manager in oral testimony program, co-lead at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, located on a traditional unceded and ancestral lands of the Musqueam. The focus related to the impacts of residential schools and other, sorry. Okay, I'm corrected, thank you. And other institutions and systems of colonialism in Canada. David holds a master's in library and information studies and a BA in history and ancient history. I think that's everybody. I'm going to hand over the mic and the floor to Kayla. I think you got the, you want to stand up here?
Hello, hello. So as mentioned, my name is Kayla Johnston, Director of Education at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But before I jump into the presentation proper, just a little bit more background information about myself. I'm an intergenerational survivor, so the collage of the schools you see up on screen are those connected to my family's history. 3 are in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. Those are Maryvale, Round Lake, and Qu'Appelle. And one's located in Alberta, known as Crowfoot. So growing up, I got to hear the stories and experiences of my mother's experience and some of those of her family members, from her siblings, her parents, her grandparents, and extended family. But also, as mentioned, I also worked as a statement gatherer for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So the group photo that you see on screen is of our statement gatherers, senior statement gathering personnel, our archivists, and other team members. There were over 158 individuals who worked in the statement gathering unit. One of the biggest challenges that you'll hear me repeat in this presentation is related to vicarious trauma. Out of the original 25 of us trained to do statement gathering, only 2 of us made it through the full commission, myself and one other, Barb Cameron, who's one of our Survivor Circle members. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this. One, it was inconsistent work. Those who required a paycheck every week, unfortunately, this was not the best setup, as we did not have survivors or individuals coming in on a daily basis wanting to share their stories or experiences. It was mainly going out to national events or community events. The other piece is that vicarious trauma piece. There are a great number of statement gatherers who did 1, 2, maybe a few statements, and they realized that was as much as they were able to do. And unfortunately, a big lesson to be learned from the TRC is they did not take as well care of their staff as they should have. We have individuals who came away with post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, and other mental health challenges because of the work they did in statement gathering or other associated tasks within the TRC. And it's one of the things we keep very much in mind at the NCTR. When it comes to our aim, when it comes to our purpose at the NCTR, I like this quote from George Erasmus. It says, "If the stories of a people are not accessible to the general public, it'll be as if those experiences never occurred. And if their voices are rendered as museum pieces, it'll be as if that experience is frozen in time. What we need are open, dynamic, and interactive spaces and participatory forms of narrative, knowledge, and research." And that's a very fitting way to step into the 21st century and into a new kind of relationship. Now, this slide will be familiar for those who were able to join me at the very start of the day. The main piece being the NCTR is that permanent home for all of those statements, documents, materials collected during the TRC's mandate, with our aim to serve survivors and families, educators and students, researchers, and the general public to ensure that history is never forgotten or repeated, that we can help foster that healing and reconciliation. Now, when it comes to statement gathering, very broadly, we see it as a means of offering a safe space for the sharing and transfer of knowledge. And this can be done for a number of reasons. One, to allow a provider to help create the permanent record of what had happened to them, whether it was at residential school, which was the primary focus of the TRC, but also those other colonial systems that have impacted Indigenous communities. Statement gathering can also be done to assist in research, in the search for unmarked burials and missing children, and as a witness to the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. Now, the NCTR team and budget is not as big as during the TRC's time. And so we are unable to meet the demand that exists out there for communities wanting us to come out and gather those statements. And so a lot of the work that we are now doing, in addition to statement gathering, is capacity building in communities. Through that support for communities, we are able to provide access to our statement gathering guide, which has transformed from a guide to direct our statement gatherers to evolving over into becoming something more of a community guide. And so the guide that exists today in November 2024 is different from, say, the guide that existed a few months ago in May 2024. It's a living and evolving document that grows based upon our knowledge and understanding and to meet those needs of the public and the communities. We offer virtual and in-person training. We provide lists of equipment that we use and things like opportunities like job shadowing at events. Our NCTR guide touches upon topics such as our general principles that we follow, getting in preparation and shaping our intentions, the statement gathering procedures from remote and in-person sessions to registration, field notes, and what to do in exceptional circumstances. Also providing information on how to conduct sharing circles, as well as post-statement gathering activities like debrief and self-care. And throughout the guide, you're going to see this little thinking emoji. And that image is really to mark questions for the community and those engaging in statement gathering to consider when developing their own statement gathering processes and activities. When it comes to principles for statement gathering, these are the general 4 tenets that we abide by: that we're accessible, that we are accountable, that provide confidentiality when requested, and that we're not doing harm. And these are implemented through these principles here: being survivor-centered, trauma-informed, that we're representative and inclusive, that we're educational, holistic, respectful, that we're voluntary, flexible, and forward-thinking. And just due to time, I'm unable to unpack all of these areas, but I'll focus on one right now related to a survivor-centered approach, what that means. Now, a survivor-centered approach is one in which we empower our survivors, or in this case, our providers, to have ownership over this truth-telling experience. We promote this by allowing each provider complete control over the content that they share and whether or not their identity is revealed. They can choose to have their statements anonymized, ensuring confidentiality. They can choose to have witnesses present. They can also choose, depending on availability, who is their statement gatherer and who is their health support and where that health support's located. For our purposes, we like to have that health support available throughout the process, but they can decide whether they're in the room, nearby, or outside. And these preferences of the provider are discussed during and before the informed consent process to ensure that their participation is voluntary and that we're flexible enough in order to meet their discussion-based needs. Now, by prioritizing a survivor-centeredness approach, we are then being flexible. We're allowing that voluntary aspect, as well as that confidentiality, ensuring that the risks of harm are reduced. And when it comes to our statement gathering processes, it is a collaborative effort. We have our statement gatherer, the person who is there to collect or gather that information. We have our health support worker, the statement provider, and any witnesses they so choose to be present. Together, we are working to facilitate that safe environment where that individual is able to share those truths either in person or remotely. Now, a condensed version of our procedures are outlined in what's known as our cheat sheet. It's a single-page front and back document which typically guides the gatherer to ensure that they're covering all of the necessary information before starting a recording. Our statement gatherers take this guide full with them, but it's quite a lengthy document, hence the use of that cheat sheet. Now, as a statement gatherer, their role is really about assisting the statement provider in sharing their experiences and recording them. The process of welcoming individuals into the statement gathering room relies upon establishing trust, fostering mutual respect, and creating that warm, friendly atmosphere. Now, before beginning or engaging in statement gathering, we ask our gatherers to really think about why are they engaging in this work, what is their motivation? Because by participating in this process, they are actively contributing to the creation of a document, a historical record that really documents some of the most severe forms of human rights violations and acts of genocide on Indigenous peoples. Now, to avoid causing harm, it's necessary for them to set aside their personal interests, refrain from imposing personal beliefs, and recognizing themselves as a facilitator, a tool to enable that provider to share that truth. So it's important that our statement gatherers possess a high level of self-awareness while fulfilling those duties as a statement gatherer. So some of the questions we asked beforehand to get people thinking is really, what are the principles that are guiding your statement gathering process? And how would you uphold those principles? Statement gathering is not about the gatherer themselves. So how do you make sure that they are showing up with the intentions to serve that provider? And to think about whether or not there is work that needs to be done on yourself before becoming that statement gatherer. Now, key piece in this is getting an understanding of what is the information that you wish to gather. For the TRC's work, it was around the residential school system, around those experiences at residential school and its impacts. The main tenet or piece that's guiding it is education-based, and you're going to see that reflected in our consent form. You want to think about whether or not this is an interview, a guided interview with a set amount of questions you wish to answer, or whether it's open-ended format. Through the TRC and NCTR, it's an open-ended format where we simply give the space and opportunity for that provider to share whatever they so choose, for however long they so choose, and whatever language they so choose. However, your means of gathering information might have a different endpoint and a different means of why you're gathering. And so that's also going to influence, potentially, the types of forms you may want to use or need. In our statement gathering package, we have a checklist which outlines all the types of forms that will be attached to that statement gathering kit. We have a registration form that collects biographical information as well as information about the residential school and contact information. We have our informed consent form, and the preamble at the start of the informed consent form talks about the use of this material for education purposes, for use in developing curriculum, for the use in documentaries or other educational-based materials. So the two forms of consent are either anonymous, where we remove the identifying features like name or face or other components, or non-anonymous, where we're allowed to attach that name or identifying information. In either case, it is still used for education purposes. We also have our metadata and summary form, which gives a short form breakdown as to the contents of that statement. But we also have providers who bring in photographs or other materials that they wish us to take copy of or have. So we'll have a material contribution form. But one piece to always think about is related to exceptional circumstances. And so we have a specialized form for serious disclosures. And I'll talk more about that in 1 or 2 slides from now. But when it comes to considerations that need to be made for informed consent, we have a long style form that answers these 5 major questions. So who are you? Why are you gathering this information? What's going to happen to that information, and where is it going to be stored? How is that information going to be used? And the last one here is, can that provider take back that information afterwards? I talked a little bit about health support already, and so one of the things to also consider is whether or not you have access to health support services for your statement gathering activities. We like to have health support available before, during, and after, as there's no point in time where we can be confident to say someone will not be triggered. And so we know health support is not always accessible, and so it's always important to consider, if you don't have that health support available, what other types of services or means can you connect them to? Do you have a list of crisis numbers or other types of health-based information you can provide them after that statement is done, just in case they are triggered at a later time? And that leads to this safety measures piece. It's important to consider, especially when we're talking about very heavy topics like missing children and unmarked burials, what safety measures need to be put in place in case of a critical incident or a serious disclosure. A serious disclosure being, if someone in a statement says, I'm going to kill myself or harm someone else, or they state that a child is in need of protection, what actions do you have to take in order to ensure their safety or the safety of others? And also to consider or think about is there additional types of training that you would like to take to be more informed? For instance, would de-escalation training be useful to your statement gatherers to de-escalate situations that may arise if someone is triggered? For those who may be attending tomorrow's training, this is something we'll be going into more detail, where we have 8 case scenarios. And so, for example, what might you do if someone's triggered during a statement and starts to get physical, where they're throwing objects at you? What do you do in such a situation? Or for instance, what would you do if they admit that they have consumed alcohol? Are you able to take a statement? Are they able to provide consent in those types of situations? Now, it's also important to look at the piece around burnout and stress. And so when becoming a statement gatherer, it's also important to think about what are the things that help you de-stress? What sort of activities would you like to include in a self-care plan? It might be useful to remember that wellness is seen on that circle rather than a single component or element. So are there activities that you can do to address your physical, mental, spiritual, or emotional well-being? Now today, it is more crucial than ever to face the brutal and tragic truth of the residential school system and other colonial institutions, policies, and laws. Only through the acknowledgement of truth can survivors and their families heal and communities rebuild. And only by coming to the honest terms with the past can we prevent the recurrence of similar violent crimes. A quote from our executive director, Stephanie Scott. And we have to acknowledge through statement gathering, a lot of it, again, is facing the most brutal crimes that have occurred to children and to communities. And that we have to take proactive steps in ensuring a statement gatherer's self-care that is essential. Many individuals in very similar lines of work have developed techniques to ensure they separate themselves from those experiences. And it's not a matter about insensitivity, but a necessary measure to protect themselves. We have to make sure that we are able to maintain that compassion and humanity while avoid becoming overly involved. And this isn't about tuning out what we're hearing, but being aware of our reactions and adjusting accordingly. Empathy, curiosity, and objectivity can all assist in achieving this balance. And I find it very helpful to think of it as I am a service that I'm providing to a statement provider that is potentially healing, And that mindset can be helpful in finding that balance to support that provider while releasing those experiences. And speaking with former statement gatherers who I've worked with, one of the most helpful pieces that I learned for them is the stories and experiences that I hear, while maybe similar to my own experiences, is not my story bundle to carry. I am simply that tool that allows them to share that information, whether it's for our archive or for their family and for others. And so that role and being healthy and coming away is integral to that truth and reconciliation process. And it's important that we prioritize that self-care so I can fulfill that duty. Now, this is just some of the content we'll be covering tomorrow, but when it comes to that capacity building, I have a contact slide here. If you'd like a copy of that guide and the appendices, please feel free to reach out to my email, kayla.johnston@umanitoba. We do virtual training to go through the guide. It usually takes about 4 to 5 hours. And we can do this at multiple times that can be recorded and kept. And depending on, again, on that budget availability, can do in-person training as well, with the idea being for your own needs, for the community, on what you hope to accomplish, achieve, or gather, you can pick and choose the materials from this guide that's going to support your efforts. You don't have to start from scratch. You can take a look to see what's already been done and build up from there. With that, my last slide here is some final contact information. nctr@umanitoba.ca or nctrrecords@umanitoba.ca if you're looking to collect those records. Thank you.
Thanks, Kayla. Our next presenter is going to be Nix.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so if you were here yesterday, you may think that Whitney Sparing looks a little different, and that's because I am not her. I am Nix Forth. I am the coordinator for the St. Joseph's Mission investigation, but I'm actually also Whitney's cousin. The two are unrelated, I promise. So I have been watching Whitney work on this for the last few years, and I joined in a professional capacity recently. I'm a settler, just like Whitney. I was born on Tsleil-Waututh territory and grew up there. And I now live on the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coquitlam, and Musqueam nations. I have an honors degree in history and Indigenous studies, and I will be going for my master's in history next year. And I am just going to present to you kind of our processes that we've gone through for statement gathering and oral history for St. Joseph's Mission specifically. Okay, next slide. Great, it's working. Okay, so this is a quote from our Cookbee, our chief that you met yesterday virtually before Sugar Cane. And it's kind of the pillar of our investigation. It's why we're doing what we're doing. It's why we're gathering oral testimonies and history. So it's time for our community and those around the country and beyond to know the truth of St. Joseph's Mission. So just what we're going to go over super quickly. So our interviewees, who we're interviewing, why we're interviewing them, why we're interested to interview them, what the survivor interviews look like in practice for the St. Joseph's Mission investigation, our processes, and then just some challenges that we've encountered in the process. You know, this isn't easy, linear, consistent work. It's unique for each individual on each day, and that comes with its own inherent set of challenges. So the most obvious one is obviously survivors of the mission. And this is probably the biggest part of our investigation in terms of sources and where we're getting our information from and what's driving our research and our findings. So we've made, you know, lots of critical quote-unquote discoveries that we've been able to plug into things like geospatial data and mapping and corroborate things that we're finding archivally. And then the other people that we're interviewing is non-Indigenous informants. So, for example, former employees of the mission, families of those buried at the historic cemetery, which is still there, although the mission building is no longer standing, the historic cemetery is still there. and members of the general public. For instance, if you saw Sugarcane yesterday, you saw that maintenance worker who was interviewed in the documentary. And while these interviews do not document the lived experience of students at residential school, they offer a unique perspective that just kind of adds that another layer of dimension to our understanding of what was going on at the time. So one example we had was a married couple who did not work at the mission, were not involved with the mission, but they had a relative that was buried at the historic cemetery. And so they visited the mission every year to pay their respects at the cemetery, and they were able to tell us, this happened in this year, this changed in this year, this is what it looked like when we were here, this was torn down in this year. So that's kind of what we're getting at with the non-Indigenous informants there. Oh, I didn't even skip. You guys, you could have said something. Okay, no. Okay, next one. So our one-stop email address. So this, when this kind of came into being very shortly after the investigative team came into being, we announced the investigative team and leads just kind of started popping up everywhere. People wanted to talk to us. So we have this one-stop email address that is constantly monitored, and this is how we facilitate interviews. So this has streamlined our process. This has allowed us to keep track of everybody that contacts us and make sure that we reach out to everybody that does contact us. So this email is connected to the lead investigator, which is Whitney, and myself, as well as support staff. So this is constantly checked. And through this email, we're able to arrange interviews, accommodate survivors' requests for health and wellness support while they're waiting for the interview, because we acknowledge that the entire process is difficult. It's not just the day of the interview that you sit down and talk. It's from the moment you decide and until well after the interview's finished. So this is an example of our interview form, or most of it at least. So this is the kind of information we ask for initially, and as you can see, this form comes to me, and I book your interview. I make sure that the room's accessible. If you have any accessibility requirements, we make sure that you have a driver if you need a driver. We make sure that you have a translator if you need a translator. If you need a family or friend or other kind of support there, we make sure that's there. If you're traveling from out of town, and this happens because so many different communities had children taken to the mission, we book your accommodation and make sure that that's taken care of. So it's really about making the process as simple and painless for the interviewee, for the survivor, as possible. And then consent. Anytime you're doing, kind of oral history work and testimony gathering, free and prior informed consent is super important to us. So this is the long version of the consent form. The consent form is 7 pages long. And we recognize that is cumbersome, but we feel it's necessary. We do have some kind of mitigating factors to make it a little less onerous, which I'll go into in the next slide. So, we just kind of want our interviewees to understand what they're doing, why it's important they participate if they feel able to, what we'll be doing with the information that they're giving us, how we plan to help them, how we plan to have health supports there, how we plan for them to have access to a clinical counselor afterwards. The benefits of participating in this research, that a recurring theme is that survivors think that what they know is not valuable and not helpful, and that's never been the case, even once. We want people to know that this is voluntary, that they can withdraw at any point in the process. We want to acknowledge the power imbalances that can come up in research relationships, especially when you are involving more academic people. We don't want anybody to feel that they're on some kind of unlevel playing field. Anonymity and confidentiality is huge to us. All of our informants remain anonymous and confidential. That information is never shared with anybody with a name attached to it. And then our plans for use, sharing the information, storing it in our own WLFN archives. So as I say, we recognize that a 7-page form is onerous for a lot of people, especially because we are interviewing a lot of elders. So this is the short form. So that's not to say the elders don't get that form. What it means is that we don't spend precious time for elders who it's maybe not so easy to come out to us going over that consent form, so that by the time we've started the interview process, they're exhausted. So this is what we go over with elders in person, and then they're sent home with that 7-page form to kind of review on their own time. So we let them know that we are investigating children who were disappeared and passed away at the mission, that we're looking into the grounds, we're doing geophysical investigations at the mission, the Onward Ranch, and other areas, and that we're also doing archival research to corroborate any findings. So prior to beginning the interview, the team, which is me, oh, thank you. Jeez, I'm like clicking on my laptop, but not the clicker. So prior to the beginning of the interview, we ensure that the interview space, as I said, is comfortable and accessible. We have a dedicated room at one of our offices that is wheelchair, walker accessible for any elders who are coming in. And once they arrive, we make sure there's refreshments. We make sure there's pen and paper if there's something they want to write down, if there's something they want to draw. Tissues, of course, a support person, which is, it's up to the interviewee whether they want a family member, a friend, or whether we have support workers on staff with WLFN that we bring in if that's requested. And then any ceremony that they want, if they want smudging, if they want brushing, any of that we make sure to accommodate for. So intake process, we've gone over. Health and wellness check-in, that happens pre-interview, during the interview, as well as post-interview. That's an ongoing relationship. The arrangement of travel logistics, we do provide an honorarium for all of our interviewees, as well as for their support people, their any drivers they have, any assistance in travel, as well as for translators. We then go through the consent process, we conduct the interview, have the post-health and wellness check-in. We do, again, have an actual clinical therapist on staff with WLFN. So if this survivor is having a particularly hard time with the interview process, we get them in touch with her. So all of our interviews are transcribed. If they were recorded, if the survivor does not want them recorded, they are not recorded. The survivor also has the option to have only audio or only video. It's really up to them. You know, this is not a one-size-fit-all thing at all. And then a lot of the times we have a second interview where we go over the transcription and, you know, just see if anything else has kind of come to mind since then. Sometimes the transcripts can jog their memory and they have more that they want to add. So some of our key documents that we have, this is not an exhaustive list. Thank you. My hero. So our investigative research protocol, our interview questionnaire, the long form and short form consent, which you saw, the interview tracking spreadsheet, so that's where we keep track of who's come in, who came in with them, health and wellness supports, and then archival or photographic intake forms. So a lot of times when elders and survivors come in, they actually do have photos of their time at the mission, or their family members do, and they're willing to donate them to us, which is fabulous. So we have a form for that as well. And, you know, kind of a common theme of the whole conference so far has been the importance of community-led initiatives and these coming authentically from community. So WLFN, we're part of the Secwepemc Nation, the larger nation. And these are some of our legal principles and philosophies that are guiding the interview process and informing the interview process. I am not a Secwepemc speaker, so I'm not going to attempt to speak these words, but so the way things are or were in your memory, remembering the actions around you, understanding that there were places you could not go to or boundaries you could not cross, telling your story as you remember it, recognize that you listened to what occurred and you are acting upon what you've seen and heard, recognizing the respect one must hold for another, recognizing that sharing is to be kind-hearted and generous, and recognizing the medicine used in telling your story is powerful. Methods. Thank you. No, I'm good. Am I not? Yes, okay, thank you, appreciate it. So interviews have been conducted using a variety of technology. So as I mentioned, spatial data and the non-technical terms for that is that, for example, runaways, that's something that we recorded a lot of at SJM. So survival will say, I ran away, and we'll say, okay, well, which way did you go from the mission? Where did you cross? What landmarks did you see? And we will actually plot that runaway route on a map using Google Earth, and we will then save that map for our records. And that complete map, I mean, it's not complete because it's a living document, is actually in our interim report, which is publicly accessible, which I will give you guys the details for at the end of the presentation. Again, audio-video recording if the survivors consent. Allowing, we do prompt our interviewees, but we're primarily concerned with them having tell their story in a way that's organic and authentic to them. So yes, we'll provide the prompts, but we don't ever cut anybody off or stop them from talking once they've started. And yeah, so the interview questionnaire is a guide, and noting questions which are answered as we deem them relevant. So there's a lot of considerations as you are hopefully kind of gaining awareness for. This is not the easiest thing in the world. So one thing is the age of our elders and survivors. We have elders who are getting really up there in age and may not be able to travel to Williams Lake. They may be confined to their homes, and in those cases, we do travel to those people and conduct interviews in their homes or in their home communities. Remoteness can then again factor into that. So again, we take care of all the scheduling, all of the travel arrangements, travel, health supports, as you've already heard. Translators, we have had instances where we have had Secwepemctsín translators required for our elders. And then honorariums, as I said, are provided to the survivors, the interviewees, as well as per diems. And then as well to those translators, drivers, and support workers. So our follow-up processes, so an outreach worker reaches out following the interview, connection to that WLFN clinical therapist I mentioned. We provide information for FNHA or other supports if they are requested. And then we do also bring it back to community with our cultural and spiritual supports. If that person is really feeling like they need ceremony, if they need extra help, we facilitate that within our community. And then finally, the challenges. So ensuring that potential interviewees are comfortable and that they trust the investigative team. So two key members of our investigative team are Charlene Bellew, who you saw in Sugar King yesterday and who was present at the conference yesterday and this morning, as well as Nancy Sandy, and both great, powerful women. But they have both served as chiefs, and so there is some political feelings that can come up with that. And some people do not want to participate in an interview with Charlene or with Nancy present. And if that's the case, then we do not have them included in that interview. We will bring in a third unrelated party that the interviewee is comfortable with. So ensuring that the proper supports are in place and ongoing for the entire process. Acknowledging that interviewees may have different terms or needs to complete their interview, like different venue, the different interviewers, as I mentioned, the interpersonal community politics and relationships. Potential to self-incriminate is a big worry for a lot of people. We have survivors who come in and say that they're ready, that they want to share their stories, but they're worried about saying something incriminating about themselves from their time at the mission. Or things happened, they did things at the mission that they are not proud of, that they're uncomfortable with. And so we navigate that with them, and we work through that process with them if that is a concern for the survivor. And then again, understanding that not all of our interviewees did attend residential school, and ensuring that this process is adaptable and inclusive to anybody who's willing to come in and share testimony with us. And that's the end of my slides, but I will tell you guys a bit about our interim report, which you would have heard about if you were here for our presentation yesterday. So our interim report was, ours being WLFN's St. Joseph's Mission investigation, was published, I believe, on October 12th of this year, so it's brand new, it just came out, and it contains all of our findings to date. And all of this information and more is in that interim report. So if you are looking at developing your own survivor interview processes and protocols, all of this information is in that interim report. As I say, as well as our findings, I believe we've conducted over 63 interviews so far over the 3 years of our investigation. And just to really drive home how important that was, so phase 1 was 16 hectares of the mission grounds proper where the school stood. And through survivor interviews in phase 1 was how we identified the additional 130 hectares. We would not have gone to those areas had our survivors not come to us and said, these are important areas that you need to look to. And it's the same thing with the lands that we added in phase 3. So it is an interim report. It is not a final report. The investigation is ongoing. We are not done. I was at an archive a couple weeks ago. We have more survivor interviews scheduled. So there will be more to come. It's just kind of, this is where we are. This is what we have. Yeah, and if you have any questions for me at the end of our presentations about St. Joseph's Mission specifically or the interim report, please let me know. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you, Nix. A reminder that we will take questions from the audience once all our presenters have spoken. Next, we'll have Kristen and David. Go ahead. Thanks.
Hello? Hello? Okay. Hi. Hello. So can everybody see that? You're going to have to remember to click. Okay. Uh-oh. Yay! Okay. So first, I am Kristen Kozar. First, I'm just going to do a brief intro. I'm the daughter of Rocky Wilson and the granddaughter of Rose Cook and Andrew Wilson, whose birth name was Caluxton. I am a intergenerational survivor. My father and my grandfather went to Cooper Island, and my granny went to Chiem Indian School across the imaginary border. Secondarily, I am the executive director at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, the longest name ever. And I'm also the co-lead of the oral testimony program there. So today we're going to be speaking about the oral testimony program that we worked through, but also I'm going to give a snapshot of what we do at the center and the intent and what we embed what we're trying to embed in every aspect of what we do there. So for today, I'm going to give a brief overview of the center, the partners we work with. David's going to reflect on our oral testimony program, ethics, the projects we are currently involved in and previous ones we've been involved in, as well as a Digital Museum Canada project, huge one, that we're endeavoring on. And then I will speak to how we work with communities and survivors, as well as ownership of records, access, presentation, and preservation. We can skip that one. So a few of the partners that we work with are the Royal BC Museum, who we currently have a partnership with and work with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. We have a partnership with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where we participate and assist with oral testimony gathering. We have a partnership as well with UBCIC, the Legacy of Hope Foundation, And we have a very close partnership with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. So I lost myself. There we go. That's you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Just to obviously introduce myself further as well. It's obviously, firstly, it's a great honor to be able to speak in an event like this. My name is David McAtackney, as previously stated. I'm originally from Belfast in the north of Ireland, but since 2012 I've been an uninvited settler on the traditional unceded and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I acknowledge my position here today as a guest and give thanks to our hosts. I'm currently the Research Manager and Oral Testimony Program Co-Lead at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Centre. And today I'm going to give more of an in-depth outline of our oral testimony program. So, informed by Indigenous knowledge and methodologies and stringent moral and ethical grounding, our oral testimony program recognises the importance and continuity of Indigenous traditions of orality, oral history, storytelling, and testimony. The program ensures, or aims to ensure, that the experiences of those who attended and were most directly affected by residential schools and other institutions and systems of colonialism are recorded, preserved, and made accessible for future use. The work links intrinsically to one of our main priorities as expressed in our mandate, and I quote, supporting the collection of materials and oral histories of residential school survivors from those who seek the support of the IRSHDC to record and have their narratives protected for future use by their families and/or a wider scholarly or community audience. Our program incorporates several different streams. We have the primary recording stream where we can support survivors and communities directly from the very beginning in the planning and gathering of truths, whether that be through particular projects or on an individual basis. And Kristen will speak more to this in the future of the presentation of the intricacies of that, because that's our mainstream. But we also have a donation stream whereby oral truths that have already been recorded can be donated to the centre, but only following a rigorous ethical assessment of how those older recordings were made and what the person whose voice is in the recording would have expressed as being their consent for how their recording may be used in the future. Linked to this, we have a partnership stream where we can sign agreements with other organisations and with community partners to hold recordings that they have as copies and can share these through our website if those recordings are already publicly available, and again, that they are consented for that public use by the person who is providing their truth in the recording. This is a programme, not a project. As such, it's an ongoing part of the work of our centre rather than a short-term initiative. So the programme is ethically grounded in a number of different and interlinked ways. Not only is it grounded in the university research ethics way, but more importantly, in the ethics of Indigenous communities in British Columbia. We also incorporated broader global Indigenous ethics perspectives, as well as what we determined were applicable international policies and principles for oral testimony collection and use. The programme was inspired and was driven by communities. There were consultations with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia even before the centre opened, during which time support for the gathering of oral truths was highlighted as a priority area by those communities. And now that the programme is live, community direction is essential to our projects and initiatives in this area. Internally, our centre's Indigenous Advisory Committee is a strong supporter and promoter of the programme and provides ongoing guidance for programme activities and strategies. This committee includes residential school survivors, Indigenous thought leaders and academics, and provides overall strategic guidance to the centre's work. In addition to this, we went through a multi-year process of consultation with our university's Behavioural Research Ethics Board, or what we call BREB for short. The length of the process probably tips people off that this was quite a challenging endeavour. It was in fact a learning experience for both parties. We were starting off our understanding from two quite different perspectives, so it took actually a lot of ongoing consultations at the very beginning, just to gain any kind of common understanding. That's before we even committed text to any kind of application. We do appreciate that the BREB was able to ask us a lot of hard questions that helped us refine and define the programme, as well as point out pieces that we maybe really hadn't thought through properly in order to bring them to a better place. Most of our discussions took place in person. This helped immensely to build relationship and rapport, and to work through the more complicated issues quicker than if we had gone the traditional route within the university context of online submission followed by electronic communication. One of the major challenges was being able to maintain flexibility within our programme, and this involved pushing against the BREB's natural inclination to have everything set in stone from the very beginning. Within our application, we recognise as much as we could those principles that might be seen to be more broadly accepted within the sphere of Indigenous research ethics, but we were able to leave room for incorporation of Indigenous protocol on the community and individual level and on a project-by-project basis. And now our programme is fully certified by UBC's Ethics Board. We recognise that there's still a lot of work to do. It's by no means a perfect programme, and I don't think it ever can be. However, it is an ever-evolving and evergreen programme that we can continue to make amendments to and strengthen year on year. We've learned from our initial projects that it does require further refinement, and that's what we'll continue to do. And then just to speak somewhat on the projects that we've been involved in. So in addition to individual and project-related residential school and day school survivor testimony gathering, including recordings on behalf of the NCTR in BC, we're also supporting recordings in areas related to other institutions and systems of colonialism in Canada and associated areas. One such project includes testimony related more directly to the topic of the 60s scoop and of the anniversary of a community partners asserting direct control over their own child welfare services. Another involved Indigenous language revitalisation recordings, specifically of legends and stories in the community's language to be used for youth education. More recently, we've been gathering voices for the Louis Brissenden exhibition. Larry Louis, as many of you may know, is a Cree author and Gruard residential school survivor who dedicated his life to sharing Indigenous stories. He returned to school in his 50s to pursue writing, producing works like Residential Schools with the words and images of survivors. He passed away in 2016, leaving a significant legacy. That project, from an oral testimony perspective, involved interviews with Larry's partner, his family members, friends, and colleagues in his work. Recently, again, we've been directed to focus more closely on the history of Indigenous healthcare in British Columbia, and have previously partnered with One Nation in the recording of their community members about their recollections of a missionary hospital that was on one of their reserves. These recordings are to be used for education and programming within the communities concerned. They also support wider efforts by the nation around GPR and other searches. And this leads in to what is kind of our main project over the next year and more, which is an online exhibition that will include the oral truths of survivors of what were called Indian hospitals, with a specific concentration on British Columbia and the three large federal institutions of Miller Bay, Coqualitza, and Nanaimo. This project will be guided by the voices of survivors and their stated need to share their stories. Survivor experiences conveyed through video audio testimony, archival documents, and digitized belongings and other artifacts will support engagement with these lived experiences. It is hoped that this exhibition will provide context to situate these hospitals within the larger history of federal and provincial medical services for Indigenous peoples. It will also provide an important dimension in efforts in reconciliation and education by demonstrating that hospitals, like day schools, the 60s scoop, gender-based violence, and the Indian residential school system all need to be part of a dialogue around colonialism. And back to you, Kristen, I think.
Hi. We're going to jump into now what has been an evergreen process in working with First Nation communities and Indigenous people as we walk this journey of the oral testimony program. I first want to note my diplomatic partner over here. It was a rigorous endeavor to go through the BREB at UBC. I am proud of this. It took us almost 3 years, and we have made the program that the ownership and the stewardship of all the recordings remains in the hands of the community, which was huge, and that's what took us a very long time to get through. And we are the first university across Canada that has done that, because universities have this weird thing with ownership. So I am proud of that. So our unwritten motto at the center is that we are in service to First Nation communities for First Nation communities. It is not UBC leadership or what have you. It is First Nation communities. That's why we exist. In this endeavor, and I'm just going to briefly note this, because it impacts the oral testimony program as well, is that at the center we are looking to indigenize and decolonize every practice that we do there, including how we see relationship, how we see working together, even to the point that our archival procedures and what have you have a basis in relationship, and that being the fundamental core of all we do. I am a huge advocate for Indigenous data sovereignty as well, which leans itself into this work. So as I noted, with relationship building, we approach it with communities not as a step-by-step procedure, noting that every community that we work with is unique and diverse, and we work at the speed of trust. This could take quite a while with some communities and less time for others, and there is a lot of nuances in between. Our job is to be completely adaptable to communities as we endeavor in this process. We, as David had noted, we don't just focus on residential school testimony, so that is a large part, because there's many other colonial systems that were imposed on First Nation people in this country. But with that, and being in the messiness of that, we do seek to walk alongside communities and to remain adaptable. And there's been times we have changed our not our consent form, but in how the process actually went for the liaisons we were working with. And we will do that on the fly to make sure everybody feels supported and a part of. So with that, we do strongly suggest that there's health and cultural supports every time we do this. And but we've also learned that every individual is different. They might care for working with, whether it's FNHL that comes in or IRSSS, or they would prefer to have a relative come and sit with them. We work with the individual in whatever works best for them. And that goes for protocol as well. And that is not just for the individual, that is for what community wants. If there needs to be a ceremony beforehand, we will participate if it's requested. We won't if we're not. And we remain fluid throughout the process. The biggest part of this, because I fully understand, I feel, that working at a university and coming into a community, universities and institutions have done incredible harm to Indigenous people in this country. And so a huge part of that is the falsehoods and deception that has happened. And so transparency is key. It's putting everything on the table, being transparent, even if it's not the greatest news or what have you, but being able to put it on the table and letting the community decide how we move forward. And then, of course, there's the consent form, which we had a very long one too. Yeah. So, yeah, it was a doozy. It was 11 at one point. But we, in this regard, I just want to note quickly, we do walk through this with those we are interviewing on a very granular level. A huge part of this is we feel that there's been many past indiscretions where it was not transparent what individuals were signing and what they were giving over in regards to consent and ownership and what have you. And so it is extremely important to us that individuals know what they are signing. We are also going to implement a video consent, so it's more accessible for individuals to be able to watch this and to walk through it, and we will be there as well to be able to do it the same if there's any questions. Thank you. Oh, now my favorite, and I only have 5 minutes. Oh, okay. So, where am I? Sorry. So, I would like to take a moment just to note that we do adhere to many of the expressions contained within Indigenous-specific guidelines. There's guidelines and policies that relate to protection, possession, and control of information about Indigenous peoples and communities. But there is also the portion of what we know by being Indigenous as well that comes into those protocols. The living element of what stewardship and ownership means. But in regards to the policies, we do include the First Nation principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, which of course is OCAP. And this is expressed from the First Nations Information and Governance Center. But we don't do the minimum, which I find is often the case when we talk about OCAP and we talk about control, access, and possession and stewardship. It is the bare minimum that is often done, and it has to be explored and adapted not only for each community, but for what is right and just for each community. And that means going further. As I noted before, anyone who records with us, they retain complete ownership of their recording. They can also nominate a family member or another person to make decisions in regards to their recording. And through consent, the individual providing the testimony is given an increased autonomy, which is their inherent right anyway, through a layered approach to how their testimony is accessed. So they are able to say to us if it would go public on our site. If they want to keep it private, communities can do this as well. We have worked it that we can walk alongside communities, do these recordings for them, bring the equipment, and at the end, if what they want is for all of that information to go to them with us having not even a piece of it, we will do that in a heartbeat. So I'm not going to get into the nerdy stuff of our collective system. And now I just lost it all. No, I didn't. Sorry. Another part I'm going to note on this, because I have to stick this in here, is one, we are currently in the midst of building our preservation plan, which from the crux of that is built off of Indigenous data sovereignty and relationality. The majority of the work we do, we are seeking to build from the Indigenous perspective rather than settling for the colonial, provincial, and federal privacy policies and legislation. I got to put it in there. I'm probably going to end with this too, sorry. because the privacy policies we have across Canada and the legislation, I'm just going to say, is inherently racist, and is only built really for the individual. It doesn't have the aspects of any sort of momentum or fluidity for a collective, as we, as of course, many Indigenous ways of knowing and being, that's what the fundamental core is. And so with that, we like to push back a little bit. And so we, we do try to push the envelope with this, and that includes with UBC Legal at the university, because there are other ways that we can uphold the inherent right of Indigenous communities and those who work at the university to reflect legislation and the policies that hold the recordings. So on that note, I have 20 seconds right now. Okay. And I just lost my spot. So I guess what I will say this last sentence or paragraph. I'm going to get in trouble. On a personal note, as the ED of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, I agree with much of what this panel has said. I was personally taught that our histories and truths run through our blood from generation to generation, blood memory. I also personally stand on the shoulders of greatness, of the ancestors who went before me, and are the reason that I exist today. And I see it as our job now, and to keep pushing forward and lighting the truth for the next generation to see, feel, and embody who they are, and this is a key element of it. We need to have recordings such as this there for the next generation so they can continue the work. What I will note, I'm going to say quickly, is something that my father used to say to me all the time, and there's no truer words spoken, I don't think. Two things. He always told me, because I was Indigenous and I was a woman, I would always have to be the hardest working person in the room. And the other one is, he said, my job for the rest of my life is to push the boulder uphill. And the goal is not to get rid of that boulder, but it's to make it smaller for the next generation. And so when we do this work, that's what we're doing. And any small piece we can do in being able to embed Indigenous ways of knowing and protocols and what have you is it's an honor and it's a privilege. So, yeah, that's it.
All right, thanks very much to all our presenters. It's so important to remember that the stories of survivors is a sacred gift to us. Now we'll open up for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone so that everyone can hear your question. Do you have the microphones available?
Hello?
Hello. Just a couple of questions. One really nerdy. For your settings for your recordings, is there a specific settings, like, 24-bit versus, 32, 16, whatever? And then is this just for British Columbia, or is it for are you going to expand to other provinces?
I usually don't need one of these because I have a big house voice, but because the reason we actually exist, or my understanding of why the center exists, is after the TRC and when the National Center was being developed, we had a number of elders, survivors, knowledge keepers from BC who strongly suggested that we have something here in BC. Because of the diversity we have here, we have 204 First Nations in BC, right? We're awesome. And as well as that many of us aren't treaty, there's other nuances, what have you. And so, voila, we exist, and that's why we exist. So our primary focus is First Nations in BC. However, we have had communities or even organizations from other provinces come and speak to us and work with us. We will never turn away a community who would like us to partner with them.
Just to speak to the equipment side of things, I can't say like with our audio, we do use like, and I think a lot of communities who are working in this area use like the Zoom like H6. It might have a H7 model now, so it's a higher quality wave file rather than like an MP3 or MP4 file. For like the video side of things, we actually, I think we are going to like actually upgrade our video equipment. We're working with an older Canon XF100 model, I think. So I think we're going to upgrade that soon. In regards to like the projects and who we work with, I'll just also add that obviously we recognize our colleagues at the National Centre as well for having like, you know, more of that broader national mandate. But we've had like training, I think, with communities that have come in from out of province specifically. So we're always open to that option. We're always open to obviously supporting the NCTR with their recordings too.
So for your technical question, I'm a historian, so I will do my best to answer it for you. But so for our audio, we use a Zoom 4-channel recorder, if that means anything to you at all. And then,
yeah, I have 2 of those.
Okay, cool.
Old and new.
Cool. And then for video, it says we use an HD digital recorder, which even I know is not helpful. But if you want to link up with me, I can give you my email, and I can get you real information on that from someone who knows.
Yeah, I could just tell from what it was, what HD is, just 1080p, not 4K.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm a videographer, tech nerd, so I know all the.
And I will just say that we also sometimes work with like a videographer from out of province as well for like large scale projects. But I think it's also important to say that we've also worked in projects where sometimes it depends on the project, where like the tech is not necessarily the most important. It's the recording itself, and you have to work within certain circumstances around like noise pollution, light pollution, remote recordings through something like, you know, the other kind of Zoom that we all know about for meetings, which I think is an MP3 or MP4 kind of file, so lower quality. So sometimes I think you just have to bend a bit on the technical, but like ideally, yeah, I mean, the higher quality, the better.
Yeah, and part of the reason I was asking was if there was specifics for, you know, settings for the audio and stuff like that. That's exactly what I meant, just if there was a set standard for the settings. Yeah, that's what I was asking.
I know like the audio, it is like the wave file, and I know it has like a serial number that I can obviously dig out for you, but I don't have it in my head right now. So what we refer to, because a lot of us are like library and archival backgrounds, it is a standard archival quality audio file, so that's why we use it for our collective access.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm from Tsuut'ina Nation, just Alberta, just beside, literally across the street from Calgary.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Chu Huslamah Kuatit empty nukis mauk. Huslamah Mamachni empty Aaron Watts Histak Chikla Tishat Mamukwa cultural coordinator for the Tishat First Nation for our AIRS team. We've been doing some work, and going back to one of the questions where, or one of the statements where the survivor, you're talking about the survivors being afraid of consequences when giving a statement. My question is, how do we heal? How do we heal as a community? We can gather statements, but we need to move forward. In order to move forward as one, we have to heal. We have to give medicine. I'm not going to say heal because that's never going to be the case. We have to give medicine to our, not only the victims of the ripple effect of the residential school, but we also have to give medicine to those abusers too, who are willing to accept that. And with that, we'd be hopefully coming full circle and moving together as one, that healing process, connecting those two so we can move forward. There's a lot at stake when we're talking about this, because we're moving into the intergenerational. Speaking on talking about the federal monies and budget, I really hope that they open their eyes to what this really is. The work is only beginning. I've heard somebody say that the word reconciliation shouldn't be used because it implies that there was a relationship. And there never was between the government and our people. But the truth is there. We're at the beginning of the truth phase. It's going to take a long time. And I heard Charlene mention yesterday as well, and it really resonated that we really need to, and others had mentioned it too, that we really need to look at our own communities and start healing ourselves as well, right? Doing what we need to do as we use our cultural practices, our cultural medicines, holding on to them. The grassroots of our communities need to be threaded into our children's future. In order to do that, we need to heal that past and hold on to them grassroots and bring them forward so we can heal and give our children a good future. Choo.
You had a question last time.
That's okay. Hello, this is Sherry. I also work on the Ua Tumen Yaksquimet Kim project, Alberni Residential School. It's my project team here. This is a little bit of a question, but also like a reflection for our statement gathering we did for phase one. Some of the most colorful feedback that we received from our statement gathering process was about consent forms. And it was honestly like more than the challenge of the subject matter, there was a lot of friction. And, you know, of course, we went to great lengths and efforts to decolonize and infuse culture in the process. And that one thing changes the tone and the dynamic and everything. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and just more, like I said, this isn't necessarily a question, but like a sharing and what is the way to further make that process. The feedback we got is it was too mamuthia and not kuas enough. It was just not It was this thing that was still, they could detect the colonialism in it. Yeah, true.
My question is, I understand Canada is changing their funding process. Some of the funds going to end March 31st next year. So what is next step for every organization across the country? How are we going to acquire those funds to continue the research? Because it's imperative.
Which one do you want me to address first?
You can start with this young lady. I say
Sherry.
because I'm a great-grandfather.
I have very strong feelings about consent forms, especially with what is often required under our Canadian legal system, because it doesn't fit, again, the collective in there. I think what happens, or this is just a personal feeling, is when you bring something that's cumbersome like that and has to cover so many aspects, because of it's not just past harms, it's current harms, right? And that institutions have, and the federal government have placed on Indigenous people. When you're sitting there, I really do see it as a break in relationship, and and you can't avoid it, and because you have to have this form filled out. It doesn't matter how you word it. It doesn't matter how streamlined you make it. It's still a break in relationship, and Sherry, you know this. I think relationality is like, it's everything. It is absolutely everything. And so you can work at building this, and it can be the reciprocal relationship building and what have you. But the moment you sit down, it's just messy with it. I do think, because I'm an optimist but a realist, is there are other avenues. There are other ways that we can push against it, where the consent form is still relatively there for what is required. But we can work towards having something that is much more accessible to First Nation communities and individuals, but also that is embedded much more in cultural representation. Like, I think of the witness blanket even, and the agreement that came between, I mean, it's not about consent, but like, it was embedded with ceremony, and it was traditionally reflective of how it was done previously. And so, I mean, there's always room to push, I think.
Nah. Everything she just said is wrong. No. I've lost my train of thought now. No, what I was going to say, I think I can't speak for every project, but I know something that we have noticed in ours also is that, well, people can obviously get flummoxed and confused by the form, but also they just generally ignore it as well, because for like obviously the testimonies, for what people are coming in to talk about, I think they're concentrating on that, on speaking their truth, and then you're trying to put a 5, 6, 7 page form in front of them, and we find people just, will just like sign it off without obviously even processing the information. I think we spoke earlier on, or I did in the previous presentation, about how we send our consent form out at least 7 days prior to give people chance to like process it even before they come in. But we find that people often will not do that because I don't want to look through this form beforehand. And I think Kristen touched on it during her presentation, her slides earlier on, about the video consent that we've been thinking of as a way to maybe get around that with people, because I think people can appreciate more that interactive element. If you sit down with a laptop and you have a video, for our purposes, it's more like, because we're maybe like asking somebody if they want their video to be housed in our center, to be part of like, like exhibition, or to be something that's more like public access, or even to be fully private, so you can like show them, and then you have a person like talking through and like showing them how it might be actually housed in the center and how people would engage in it from a like an education and a programmatic kind of point of view. So there are certain things that we can like use, I think, to like mitigate against that. And I think also, to get around the first point that I talked about, we also really heavily emphasize with people about the consent form is not the be-all and end. You're not signing your life away. You can continue to have complete ownership over that. If you change your mind, you just change the consent. And so if someone comes back and they read the consent form afterwards, we make sure to say, oh, you don't just go, oh, I can't change it now because I've signed this. People can come back to us, and then we can like remove recordings or give it back to them, or like make amendments or edit it. So.
Just to add on to that, from the consent process from the NCTR to the TRC has changed. The TRC's process, the two consent options were public or private. Since moving over to the NCTR, it's now anonymous or non-anonymous. And as I mentioned, the full kind of lead-up talks about the education purposes. And so there's the long form, which the provider takes home, which answers all of those questions, the most common questions, and how to get in contact. And again, the idea being they have a means to reach out and able to address or change that level of consent they so choose. But also, for instance, we do split consent. So a statement can have a partial piece that is public versus another piece, I should say, a partial piece that is anonymous versus another component that is for non-anonymous, or that public piece with their name attached to it. So our consent has gone through a number of iterations, and I imagine there could potentially be future developments when it comes to making it more easily accessible based upon that feedback, as you mentioned, when it comes to addressing or providing the information about what that statement is going to be used for and how they would like to use it.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo your sentiment. We obviously ran into the same roadblock like super quickly. We realized that for our elders, a 7-page consent form is just not practical. And we send it home with them, and they probably don't read it, and they probably throw a signature on it. And I think your question is touching on like a lot of larger issues, but maybe that's just how my mind works. But, the consent form is inherently comes from academia. And no matter how much we change it or alter it, it's kind of coming from a colonial place. This need to have a signature on a piece of paper saying that this is okay. Well, that goes against the entire purpose of oral testimony. It's the supremacy of the written word, which is going against what we're trying to do here in collecting oral history and oral testimonies. And so I think it's a real problem, and I completely agree with what Kristen said, that it's an absolute break. It's a rupture in the relationship. I think it puts the interviewer in the research position and the interviewee as the researched, and that's not okay. That's, as I said in my presentation, we don't want that. We want it to be community. We want it to be as equals, a dialogue, a conversation. And so, I mean, if it were up to me, like, I'd say, like, screw it, right? Why can't this be a conversation? Why can't this be a dialogue? And if that needs to be recorded, then so be it. But we're operating under these constraints of colonial governments and colonial institutions, and unfortunately we just have to make the best of a bad situation with that, while at the same time acknowledging that free and prior informed consent is really important.
I know we're at time, but I'm gonna still talk. We don't actually need a signature, though. We don't. As long as, even if we can do it on a video recording, and the consent is there, or there's other means to go about it, that we've sort of seen a tiny bit of a ripple effect happening with that. I am a believer in pushing the box, right? Like, if this is harming and breaking relationship, there's got to be another way. And so we got to push that. And even if it's not the norm. And, but yeah, the consent does have to be there, but it doesn't have to be a signature.
There was a second question. I know we ran out of time, but it was access to funding. Okay, so we are out of time. Basically, even as a national organization, we're still struggling with funding. I don't have core funding for statement gathering. It's funded by books, just as a note. So I know that the struggles exist out there for others also doing the work.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions. Thanks so much to everyone for your questions, and thank you to panelists for sharing your knowledge. Have a good evening. Thank you.